guys, it's Dr. Franklin, and in this presentation, I'll be talking about the cognitive science of religion. If you've ever sat back and wondered what role the mind plays in people's religious beliefs and experiences, then this is the presentation for you. In this presentation, I'll be considering the idea of whether or not religion is natural. When I talk about if religion is natural, I'm not talking about it in the sense of wondering if it emanates from a genetic predisposition of some sort, but rather I'm wondering if religion is in alignment with type 1 thinking. Type 1 thinking is a type of thinking that has been explained in dual processing theory. Type 1 thinking is basically thinking that human beings exhibit that is effortless, it's intuitive, it's automatic, it doesn't require a great deal of energy. So, within that understanding, I'm wondering if religion is natural. And in this presentation, I'll talk with you about some research that seems to indicate that it indeed is. And in this presentation, we'll also be talking about the different cognitive tools that people use to ascribe religious beliefs and experiences as being of a particular orientation or of a particular spirituality framework. And we'll also be discussing if the cognitive science of religion is compatible with the theistic worldview. So listen, if you're interested in understanding the role that the mind plays in terms of the mental tools and how we use it to ascribe experiences as being religious or spiritual, then this is the presentation for you. Let's get into it. Is religion natural? Macaulay makes the case that science is unnatural compared to religion from a cognitive standpoint. So he's building evidence for religion being natural by showcasing how unnatural science is. He makes this case by talking about how type 2 thinking comes later in life because type 2 thinking is very much associated with scientific reasoning. This is not to say that all scientific reasoning comes from type 2 thinking. The beliefs, the models and theories about the world that come from reflective scientific thinking often vary significantly, though, from the beliefs about the world that emerge from natural, unreflective thought. Theories like evolutionary theory, atomic theory, do not seem right to us, and perhaps as a result, this is kind of highlighting how religion is natural. Instinctively, for many individuals, natural selection, the idea that matter is composed of particles, just don't seem right to people. And though these theories are supported by empirical evidence, many people's gut tells them that there has to be a creator behind the creation. There has to be some kind of purpose in a design. Even theological theories such as the hypostatic union of God and man seem strange to many individuals because it's not intuitive. So certain aspects of certain theologies are a bit unnatural, but here Cawley is coming up with evidence to support how these theories that are presented within the presentation seem extremely unnatural. And he's highlighting that there are different components of religion that may be unnatural, but in an entry level type of way, religion seems to be very natural. Human beings have belief in agents. This is another piece of evidence that he's providing for religion being natural. Now, it's known that science has virtually eliminated any role of agents or beings that not merely respond to their environment, but also initiate action on the basis of their own internal states, such as beliefs and desires. Science looks to natural causes like molecular causes, cellular causes, neural causes to explain phenomena. Appealing to agents is not considered legitimate in science. In many instances, we do not even critically examine our type 1 cognitions, and we often use heuristics or decision-making skills to solve everyday concerns. However, science progresses because of robust analysis of theory and reflection. Another piece of evidence to support that religion is natural. Syllogistic reasoning problems are a bit problematic for us. We have a hard time solving reasoning problems, particularly if conditions are involved. Now, This can really get complicated when the conditionals are abstract in form versus when they're concrete. For example, this is an example of some concrete conditionals. You have a major conditional listed at the top of the columns, and then the minor conditional is listed second in the columns, and then finally we have a conclusion that can be garnered based on deductive reasoning utilizing the first two conditionals. Most people will arrive at the last box in each column as a result of deductive reasoning because we're dealing with concrete examples. But when things become much more abstract, it becomes difficult for individuals to solve syllogistic reasoning problems. Humans often employ the availability heuristic in their everyday lives. The availability heuristic refers to the tendency we have to estimate probabilities according to how easily we can come up with an example. For example, people are hesitant to fly in an airplane because they can easily recall a deadly plane crash, but it's actually statistically safer to fly in an airplane than to drive in a car. So again, people are using type 1 thinking to solve everyday problems such as should they fly, should they not? And we see type 1 thinking at work in syllogistic reasoning problems that are concrete. All of this seems to lead to evidence that maybe religion is natural. Ultimately, when we take all of these pieces of information into consideration, religion is natural in that dualism, creationism, and teleology are difficult to eliminate. They occur very early in childhood, and even if a person wanted to eliminate these perspectives, it would be extremely difficult to do so. Now, let's talk about the importance of minds in religion. In terms of causal reasoning and intuition, minds develop in similar fashion across cultures and societies. Minds are designed to solve particular kinds of problems. In other words, they're not just processing information machines. Minds do not passively receive information, but they shape and color perception and cognition that we experience. Shaping and coloring of the mind affects patterns of religious action and thought. And then finally, some thoughts and behaviors are considered to naturally emanate or develop as a result of natural cognition or type 1 thinking. Now let's talk about mental tools that may be employed in religious belief and experience. Let's first talk about categorizers. Categorizers receive information from our senses and uses that information from our senses to assess what kind of thing we encounter. The most important categorizer for the purposes of our discussion is the agency detection device. Other categorizers include the object detection device, the artifact identifier, and the face detector. Now, describers provide the necessary properties to a given object identified by a categorizer. For example, the living thing describer mentioned above would automatically generate the properties required for a living thing, such as it requires nutrition, it grows, it can reproduce, and it will eventually die. Finally, the facilitator function helps you to describe the behavior of others in particular situations that are more complex and require more explaining than is provided by simply leaving people to their own thoughts about another person's motives. So, these are some of the cognitive tools that are at work when people are ascribing religious belief and religious practice to phenomena. Now, let's talk about some particular tools of the mind in a little more detail. Let's start off by talking about the agency detection device. The ability to distinguish objects and agents in our environment is crucial for our survival. We will naturally believe, at least initially, that an agent was the cause of a noise in our environment, even if we cannot physically detect him or her right away. We are biased to this belief because the predilection for this cognition has survival advantages. It's better to assume that we heard a threat because then we can take appropriate action in response. The false positive, if indeed it occurs, is a small price to pay. The agency detection device that we have in our minds is hypersensitive. We see agency sometimes when it's not there. And agents are the mind's natural default explanation. If you hear something rustling 10 to 20 feet behind you, you naturally assume that there's an agent back there. And then you typically tend to be extreme and negative as you brace yourself to survive whatever is approaching you. When employing this device, there's a trade off between speed and accuracy. Speed is a more important factor for obvious reasons, but sometimes mistakes abound. And all in all, it's worth it for survival reasons. So sometimes we react rather quickly and we're wrong, and sometimes we react rather quickly and we're right. The speed sometimes causes us to be less accurate, but the likelihood of being less accurate is worth it. The hypersensitive agent detection device is extremely sensitive to movement. If we notice something moving, even if it's an inanimate object or image, we immediately assume that it's being caused by an agent. This could be a dot moving on the wall, or it could be a piece of paper rustling on the floor. Now, let's talk about the theory of the mind. Now, the theory of the mind emphasizes that an agent could be anything in your environment, perceived physically or believed to be invisible, moves with a purpose in a goal-directed manner, and they have minds. Once the agency detection device detects that an agent caused an event in the environment, other cognitive tools are utilized from the mental toolbox. Describers, possibly facilitators if someone else is around. One will automatically start thinking that the agent has intentions, desires, and a purpose. These tools are important because gods are agents and gods are thought to have minds. When events cannot be explained by way of biology, human intervention, or mechanistic intervention, the hypersensitive agency detection device finds an agent. For example, Christian theists are open to the possibility of divine intervention, but CSR is interested in what is the origin of the belief. Where does it come from within the mind? So Barrett argues that this belief has its origins in the work of the hypersensitive agency detection device and the theory of mind mental tools. So religious beliefs can be thought to be no different as far as the origin is concerned from other beliefs that we hold. Barrett believes that what accounts for the transmission of religious beliefs are that they are minimally counterintuitive, or MCI. Barrett believes that religious beliefs spread because they are minimally counterintuitive and that they hold details that go against physical laws as we know it and our living object describers as we know it, but it is not too grandiose. For example, within the Christian tradition, Jesus feeding thousands of people with a little bit of fish and bread. So it's a bit counterintuitive in that he's feeding thousands of people with singular items, but it's not too far out there. In other words, there's not a whole bunch of hyperbole or exaggeration in regard to the story. Everything else seems typical up to the point where the bread and the fish are being spread. Jesus walking on the water. That story, definitely counterintuitive when you consider gravity. But having Peter sink as he's moving towards Jesus isn't counterintuitive. So the thing that's really counterintuitive is Jesus is walking on the water. Everything else seems a bit reasonable, right? Muhammad in a trance, speaking the words of Allah. Being in a trance seems typical depending on what your worldview and religious belief system is. But speaking the words of Allah, that's a bit counterintuitive, but it's not several things within that narrative that's counterintuitive. It's just, one thing. So it's thought that many of the religious beliefs and narratives that spread are counterintuitive in minimal regards. And for the most part, everything else seems to be in line with physical laws, and that's why they spread. Now, if There was a story spreading about a cat flying and talking at the same time, then that wouldn't be minimally counterintuitive. That would be majorly counterintuitive. A flying cat and then the experience of that cat talking. I mean, that would be really counterintuitive, and perhaps that story wouldn't get off the ground. So, evolutionary theory on cognitive science of religion and the compatibility of cognitive science of religion with theism. Some research that is cited in regard to the cognitive science of religion emphasize how religion is positively related to physical and mental health. People who score high on measures of religiosity tend to live longer, have lower rates of disease, and have a higher satisfaction with life. So, all of those things seem to support the notion that individuals with mental concepts that bias them to see reality in religious terms have a reproductive advantage. Another perspective is that religion is not adaptive per se, but is a byproduct of cognitive structured adaptations that serve non religious practices. For example, a cognitive structure such as a face detection and agency detector could make the group stronger and aid in defeating the enemy and recognizing your allies in battle. After the battle and surviving, those same structures can aid one in worship of a deity and synchronize rituals that bolster unity and increase the likelihood that the entire group will survive. So, with the first two bullets, folks, what's being done is you are seeing how evolutionary theory is being synchronized or aligned with cognitive science of religion. Learning about the mental mechanisms that result in religious beliefs does not necessarily have to challenge the justification of accepting those beliefs. So, Kevin Siebold says that knowing about calculus or quantum physics provides no survival advantage, and many of these things can be viewed as byproducts of our cognitive tools. Just because they are byproducts does not mean that they are necessarily false. Now, for some, CSR research supports atheistic worldviews. Most researchers in CSR are relatively neutral in their views about the relevance of their work to the truth of religious beliefs, but there are many who interpret the CSR research as reason to not believe in a God at all. Many individuals wholeheartedly believe in methodological naturalism and ontological naturalism. Methodological naturalism holds that science is the only way to accurately study the physical world, and ontological naturalism specifies that only the physical or material world exists. Belief, though, in methodological naturalism does not necessitate ontological naturalist worldview. Essentially, one can have one without the other. One can believe that science is the only way to study the physical world while still believing in God. So, this is especially the case if an individual has two types of propositions. One of their propositions can be things that cannot be changed as it ensures their survival and worldview, such as there is a God. And then maybe they have another proposition that can be modified or outright rejected without threatening the person's worldview. So, this wraps up our discussion of the cognitive science of religion. Within this discussion, try to touch on some evidence that validates or rather corroborates or supports uh, the perception that religion is natural. And we talked about the importance of the mind and how it affects religious beliefs and practices. From there, started talking about these different mental tools that aid us in our everyday lives and also lead us to ascribe certain experiences as being religious and certain experiences as being secular. And then we rounded the bend and we applied evolutionary theory and the cognitive science of religion to people's perception of survival and their perceptions in regard to its compatibility with theism. Hope that this presentation was helpful, and I look forward to providing more presentations like this moving forward. Take care.